Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much to the program committee as well for inviting me to talk about this. I have to admit, I have equal amounts of anxiety and excitement and apprehension in today's talk. So Andy asked me the question, can you answer the question, the sports medicine physician, is it time for a reboot? The answer is yes. Thank you very much. I'll be taking questions. I have nothing to disclose. So the objectives are, there have been recent, extremely public crises that have raised questions about the integrity and behavior of sports medicine physicians, and specifically physicians in our society. To approach this, we are going to define a concept called the medical social contract. We're going to acknowledge that the social contract was indeed broken and trust was lost. And a genuine apology is really a start to this process. And then we're going to evaluate how to move forward and how to strengthen this contract, how to make amends for what has happened. So I want to thank a number of people. My colleague and friend Jim Barrett at the University of Oklahoma, Marcy Foston and Ellen Casey, team physicians for USA Women's Gymnastics. I want to thank Jordan Weber, Olympic gold medalist, a Larry Nassar survivor, assistant coach at UCLA Gymnastics. We'll have the privilege of hearing Jordan's presidential keynote speech later on today. I want to thank Andy for taking on and asking me to do this very challenging task. I want to thank Jason Matusak and Chad Carlson, both for their input and feedback and process along the way. Also, I think it's quite appropriate to thank Aurelia Nativ and Dave Cruz for their feedback. Aurelia gave me feedback as most recently as 2 hours ago, and I was able to incorporate this. Next slide, please. Now, when you give acknowledgements like that, it's very nice, but at the same time, if I really blow this talk, the responsibility is shared among many. First, I'm going to speak about Richard Strauss. Dr. Strauss was the founder of AMSSM. In fact, he was the editor for my first publication in medicine. I wrote a book chapter for him, and in fact, he sat next to me alphabetically during the founding of AMSSM. There are a number of public issues that arose posthumously about Dr. Strauss's behavior, and we're not going to talk about them today, but we are rather going to talk about the next gentleman who, in terms of self-disclosure, Larry Nassar. 25 years ago, when I was program chair, I actually invited, and Dr. Nassar agreed to chair a half-day session on Olympic athlete or gymnastic athlete injuries. He would be somebody that I would call if I had a challenging gymnastic case, because he was acknowledged as the country's leader in gymnastic medical care. We all know and are aware of the large picture, the big picture about Dr. Nassar's behavior. And in fact, Jordan Weber is going to spend time later on in the presidential keynote to talk about specifics of this case and its implications. So the question that we have as a group, as a society, AMSSM, is how are we going to address this issue? How are we going to acknowledge the process and to move forward with what has already happened? So thanks to Jason Matusak, who, while I was struggling about how to put the context of this together, Jason provided me a slide of the concept of the medical social contract. And indeed, we can think of this, the broken trust, one of the most fragile aspects of the social contract of medicine, that this happened. And indeed, harm was done under the guise of expert medical care. So what the social contract of medicine is this relationship in the patient coming to us, relying on us, expecting competent, ethical, professional care for their health and well-being. In turn, we are given respect, social prestige, financial reward, and the autonomy professionally to regulate aspects of what constitutes our care. So for decades, this contract was actually implicit, not specifically spelled out, and only recent medical ethicists have had a formal discussion and formal analysis of what indeed is the medical social contract. Now, to roll back history, in truth, I was a philosophy major, double major, philosophy and biology in college, so I'm going to bore you with a little bit of history and philosophy here. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French educator and philosopher, was the creator of the concept of the social contract. Indeed, what Rousseau did was he established this contract, in essence, to balance the organization of government to govern people and the well-being of individual people. So this contract was between society and the individual. And while there were flaws in his original assumptions, and I'll talk about that a bit later, the framework of the social contract indeed was really what developed as the framework later on as the medical social contract between patient and physician. Rousseau's flaw was the following. He had an optimism in human nature. He coined the term the natural man or the natural woman. And this would be an individual like you and I, living alone in the wilderness, and his assumption was the natural person was a good person. This person would seek survival. They'd do what was healthy, what was best for them. And in this setting of being a natural man or a natural woman, you inclined towards doing the right thing and you survived. However, what he didn't take into account is the fact that people probably don't always do the right thing. So the social contract will break down when parties don't do the right thing, and this is what happened. There are two references you can take from the handout, Crues and Bougueras, who defined the medical social contract based upon Rousseau's early work. And the concept of the social contract, one, for our purposes this afternoon, will establish a foundation for what went wrong. In a sentence, trust was broken. Trust is the most fragile and central aspect of the medical social contract. It sets the groundwork, and we're going to use this context to talk about what has to be done to move forward. The first thing that has to happen, and it breaks my heart when I look historically, I'm not certain that the gymnasts who were the victims were ever really formally apologized to. So one, as a founder of AMSSM, as a fellow member of our society, I'm going to say that today we're going to make a formal apology. One, we're going to acknowledge that harm was done to many people. Two, we're going to recognize that the medical social contract was indeed broken. Three, genuinely, I'm going to express remorse, bad feelings, sad feelings that we as a professional society feel badly and regret what happened. And then we're now going to talk about restitution. What can happen? What kind of dialogue can occur to prevent this from ever happening again in the future? So here is the reboot. We are sports medicine physicians. We're going to ask ourselves to recommit to the ethical components of the medical social contract. What we're counting on is, in order to reestablish this, we will reestablish trust from our patients and to society for what's at stake. We're going to ask what are their actions, behaviors that we might do. It may not be this egregious, but do we do other things that jeopardize the trust to our patients central to this contract? So it isn't just outlandish, illegal, egregious behaviors. But what about things like complex return-to-play questions? Do we as sports medicine physicians cut corners? Do we allow latitude for return to play where maybe we really shouldn't? Do we do procedures that are in the process of being vetted, of being studied? The research is not yet firm. What are things that were done, that we perform, that are really on the edge? And maybe you have to talk to colleagues, maybe are beyond what we should be doing. In essence, how can we look in the mirror, examine our shortfalls? How can we talk to our colleagues and share with them and ask for their input about our shortfalls? So the medical social contract basically consists of competent medical care with constant learning, constant commitment to learning, and steady improvement. We also want to provide the highest ethical standards for care. What is best for our patients? We need to professionally self-regulate ourselves and others, our community of physicians. No one wants to confront a colleague and say, you know, I think you're doing this wrong. You want to pull a person aside in a very gentle way, correct them if you see something. And this accountability is very important. And also, as we provide care, we have to listen, respond, act, be constantly in the moment. So the weakness in the social contract is the fact that self-regulation, self-governing policies and procedures for the care of medicine, if we're responsible, it's a tremendous responsibility. It's part of being a professional. It's part of our medical identity. If we fail in doing this, we lose autonomy. If we lose autonomy, this is a big deal. If we can't review ourselves and we can't review our colleagues, then others will do so outside of our professional identity. I was raised in Stockton, California, which every year ranks at the bottom 3 of Forbes' most miserable places to live. But having been raised in Stockton, I learned a certain blue-collar mentality about life, and I remember in high school, one of my colleagues who constantly got in trouble in school said, basically, if he couldn't control his behavior, the police were going to have to control his behavior, and he would have to get put in a prison because of that. So that's what happens, is basically if you can't control our behavior, if we can't control ourselves, someone else is going to do that. So a great deal is at stake if we fail to show that we can effectively self-regulate. Loss of autonomy will lead to burnout. And in fact, I have to tell you, my belief is that burnout can't be corrected by a vegan diet, by regular exercise, by performing yoga and deep meditation and mindfulness alone. Then the current setting, my feeling is that it is the loss of autonomy, the loss of our control over our professional day-to-day lives, moment to moment, that make us lead to burnout. And indeed, programmatic changes have to occur that will allow us to better self-regulate. I don't need to cover this. All of you know the similar problem. So how indeed do we reboot? What I want us to do is to go back to the values of our founders. Communication, dependence on each other, communication and trust with each other. All of these things are effective values that we've held from the very beginning. Trust and respect. How do we share dialogue? How do we demonstrate that we're worthy of trust that are given to us by patients in our society? So networking has always been a strong value in AMSSM, and coming to these meetings, it's not only the core educational content that you're learning, or learning about cutting-edge procedures, or learning about newer methods and techniques, newer medications that are used in challenging medical conditions like ADHD, and management of opioids, and management of cannabis. But it's also the networking, it's talking with colleagues. It's being able to go to a colleague and say, I feel uncomfortable about this, or I need your advice about this because I'm not sure what I'm doing is the right thing. And trusting and relying on that networking, that communication. To share concerns, it's important that we never become isolated, literally or figuratively, where we can't turn to a colleague and ask for help, ask for advice, ask for what the right thing to do is. And in so doing, as we do this, work together for policy, written policies at a local, regional, and national level to implement change. So we owe each other the respect of holding each other accountable for our choices, our actions, our practices in both formal and informal issues. It might have to do with medicine. It might have to do with advice about how you're going to deal with a problematic neighbor. We, in so doing, will perform continuous quality improvement and keep an observation when a colleague struggles or strays off the path. And this is something that's really important. I'm not trying to create an excuse for those that may have abused patients, but we know from psychodynamics that those that abuse were likely abused themselves. So it's important if you see a colleague that you worry is straying, if perhaps they've been abused, because then the cycle of abuse can continue, and it's our job to stop it. We are placed in tremendous positions of responsibility and power. In sports medicine, we have the privilege of caring for active people. People are choosing to take a step forward for their health. We have the privilege of taking care of elite athletes, athletes that bring pride to our country. And in this position of responsibility and power, it's also a responsibility to clean up our messes. And in moving forward with USA Gymnastics, much work ahead lies in terms of policy making, rebuilding trust, reestablishing the medical social contract. David Cruz, Ellen Casey, Marcy Foston, Early and Ativ, all of you are challenged with all of these responsibilities in moving forward and to reestablish identity and trust, integrity in the process of this scandal. And finally, thanks to Ellen Casey's comments, we really must engage in dialogue. Really, sometimes I think not enough has been said to the victims, to the patients. We should have a discussion among ourselves. This is our first open forum as a society to talk about this, even though it's happened a long time ago. We shouldn't shy away from discussing what's happened. We shouldn't be afraid to apologize. We should engage in the athletes to ensure that this won't happen again moving forward, and to the athletes who have suffered in the past. Vigilance, transparency in our dealings at both the individual patient-athlete level and at the policy level, regionally and nationally, are our responsibility. So on behalf of AMSSM, I'm privileged to offer this. Again, I have equal parts excitement and anxiety and apprehension in doing this, and I hope that you receive this well. Thank you very much.